Hey, APUS Eagles, welcome back to week 3 of APUS History from Home. Guys, we're going to be jumping into this packet right here. All right, the Roaring 20s to the Crash. Before we do that, though, real quick, I just want to give you guys a quick update on the AP exam, what we know so far, which is not a lot yet, but I think very quickly we're going to be finding out more. So far, we do not know the date of the exam, but there's a couple proposed changes. One of them is that there might actually be 2 test dates, which would allow either the school to decide which of the 2 test dates they want to do, or possibly the students to choose which of the 2 test dates they would like. My assumption is we'll go ahead and do the later of those 2 dates if they do end up offering 2. There's the possibility that they just end up offering 1 date, but my understanding is if that's the case, it would also be later. So we're probably looking at the very end of May for your AP exam. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, it's going to be an online exam. It's not going to be a pen and paper test. It's going to be done online. It's going to be 45 minutes long. We know that too. So instead of that 3.5-hour exam that we were planning on, you're looking at about 45 minutes for the test, which is much, much faster. Obviously, that means that the format of the test is going to be different too. We do not know exactly what that means, but what we do know is that it's going to be a series of short response questions or some sort of written response questions. Basically, what I'm saying is that it's not going to be any multiple choice. Now, I know we've been practicing multiple choice, and some of you guys are thinking like, oh my gosh, that was such a waste. Definitely not a waste. Remember, think about what multiple choice questions do for us. Not only do they test us on the topics that we might be asked about, but number 2, multiple choice questions give you guys a good idea of what they like to ask about certain topics and how they ask about those. So even though they might not be in multiple choice format, the information that you guys are gaining and the practice that you're gaining from the multiple choice is going to be beneficial on any type of written response question. Now, the AP College Board has said that they're going to come out with some more clear information on Friday of this week. I will make sure that I keep you guys updated on this, but one more time, I do want to let you guys know I am not concerned about these changes, and neither should you. All right, the material is going to be the same as the stuff that we have been covering all year long. You should feel confident that you know what you need to know for the exam. And as far as the skills go, we've been practicing short answer questions, DBQ essays, long essay questions, analysis of documents. There's not going to be anything new on there as far as skills. The format of what it looks like might be different, but ultimately you guys are going to be in really good shape and you're going to know what you need to do. So please don't be concerned about the exam. Again, I will get you guys more information after Friday once I find out more about the exam. All right, with that being said, I do want to take you guys through a very, very quick review of yesterday, Monday, day 1 of your Roaring 20s note packet, and then today, day 2 of the Roaring 20s note packet. So hopefully you guys had an opportunity to get into those packets, to do some research on those topics that your note packets hopefully are somewhat filled in, and maybe I can give you guys some additional information that might be helpful. Ready? Okay. So we started here on this page, the Red Scare. Okay, the first thing that you guys needed was a definition. Now, hopefully you found in doing your research that the Red Scare is the nickname given to this time period in the early 1920s. This is right after World War I has ended. This time period in the early 1920s where there's this fear of communism and radical foreign ideas that might be infiltrating the United States. Okay, now again, this is right after World War I. The fear is that communist ideas or these radical foreign ideas might destroy the American way of life. Okay, so this is the concept of the Red Scare. It is a time period of hysteria. If you needed to compare it to other time periods in history that are sometimes looked at as being similar, you might say the Salem witch trials of the colonial period. They also like to compare the Red Scare to McCarthyism, which is a topic we'll talk about coming up right after World War II. And McCarthyism is actually the exact same concept, just a different time period. This idea of the fear of communism infiltrating the U.S. government and the infiltrating the U.S. way of life. Red Scare was after World War I. McCarthyism is going to be after World War II. Now, the next category here was the causes of the Red Scare. Well, you guys already know some of the causes. We know that nativism has been around for quite a long time. But you guys know that nativism also increased during the Gilded Age because of the influx of immigrants. So because of the influx of these new immigrants, remember the difference, right? Old immigrants versus new immigrants. Because of the influx of these new immigrants, we know that nativism has increased, all right? And that nativism is still hanging around after World War I. The other thing that we know about World War I is that after the war was over with, there's already this sentiment of wanting to become more isolated again, right? Less interventionist, more isolated. So the idea of foreigners coming to the United States and bringing their foreign cultures and their foreign ideas, and again, potentially some radical ideas like communism, very scary to Americans. Okay, so again, that isolationist feeling or desire after World War I is another reason that the Red Scare takes place. But your last reason for the Red Scare, don't forget that the Russian Revolution had just taken place, right? V.I. Lenin in Russia, 1917, overthrows Tsar Nicholas II and creates the first communist government ever in history with the creation of the Soviet Union. This information, of course, is in the United States that this has taken place. And that revolution being so fresh in people's minds also helped to sort of precipitate this idea of the Red Scare. Okay, there are a couple things taking place during this time period too that go along with the Red Scare. So it says the next category, right, the rise of nativism and the Quota Act. One thing that I did want to mention, because it was in the last set of multiple choice that you guys hopefully were able to get to on the College Board website, is this idea of the Palmer Raids. Palmer Raids. Okay, this takes place during the time period of the Red Scare. We have our Attorney General at the time. His name is A. Mitchell Palmer. Okay, A. Mitchell Palmer is convinced that communists have infiltrated the U.S. government and that it's his responsibility to protect his government from communist ideas. So he goes on what are known as the Palmer Raids. The goal of the Palmer Raids is obviously to seek out suspected communists who might have infiltrated the U.S. government and expose them and ultimately expel them from the United States. So this is going to take place between 1919 and 1920, the series of Palmer Raids conducted by the U.S. Department of Justice. Okay, if you need to write any of this down, make sure you're pausing the video as you guys need to. But the goal, again, is to capture as many suspected communists as possible. I do have a couple numbers for you guys that I wrote down. 249 radicals, right? Radicals. Were deported during this time period, actually found here in the United States and expelled from the country. You'd also have over 3,000 arrests of suspected communists as well. So it shows that fear and that hysteria of the time period. Another thing that the U.S. government will do because of this fear of immigration and, again, foreign ideas is they'll create something called the Quota Act. Now, there are actually two of them, and hopefully you guys found that. The first Quota Act was passed in 1921. The next one's going to be passed in 1924, so just 3 years later. It's going to be a little bit more strict version of the first Quota Act, a little bit more clear version of it. But basically what it does is it sets, just like the name says, a quota system. And basically the idea behind that is that the U.S. government will figure out how many people from a particular country currently live in the United States, and they will allow a certain percentage of immigrants from that country each year. So let me give you guys an example, right? For the Quota Act in 1921, it was 3%. So however many immigrants came from, let's just say, Italy, right? However many Italian immigrants were already here in the United States, they would take 3% of that number and they'd say, okay, in 1922, you can have 3% of that number, and that's how many we're going to allow in 1922 from Italy. Okay, that's the idea. 1924, they clarified a little bit, make it a little bit more specific, where they basically say we're going to use the 1890 census and all the immigration data from 1890, and we are going to allow 2% of immigrants from each country based on the number of people that were already here in 1890. So it's very simply just this idea of the quota system. And I do want you guys to hopefully get a chance to look at this cartoon down here. Again, see what they're doing here, right? This idea is that there might be lots and lots of people from Europe that want in, but we're going to shrink that number down using this quota system and only allow in a certain percentage of those people. Okay? Questions on the Red Scare? Well, you can't ask them to me because, well, I'm on a video, okay? The Red Scare, though, one more event just to focus on here, and hopefully you guys had a chance to read through this Sacco and Venzetti case. Now, this is a really famous court case in American history. Again, it's one of those, like, top 15 that you guys need to know. But the case of Sacco and Venzetti, hopefully you had a chance to do the questions, too. If you didn't, you should pause the video now and read through this. Okay, but assuming that you guys did these questions, again, a little space for your notes here, and hopefully you guys kind of got the gist of the story. There is a robbery that ended up turning into a murder in a Massachusetts shoe company, and there were witnesses, and they said that the murderers, the people that had committed this act, were two Italian men. Now, there were two Italian immigrants that were somewhat sort of infamous in the neighborhood at that time. And this is Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. These guys are known for being not only Italian immigrants, but somewhat radical anarchists. They were outspoken against government. They were also anti-war during World War I and anti-draft. So these guys are kind of seen as troublemakers. This is exactly what the Red Scare is about, right? These guys are immigrants. They have more radical ideas than what are normally accepted in the United States. And now this crime takes place. Again, witnesses say, well, I think it was two Italian men, and police immediately are drawn to Sacco and Venzetti, and they're going to be arrested. They're going to be put on trial. In July of 1921, they're going to be convicted and they're going to be sentenced to death. The thing about this trial, though, guys, is that it's total garbage. There's a serious lack of evidence to prove that Sacco and Vanzetti were the ones that committed this act. They claimed all along their innocence. And regardless of that, regardless of the fact that there's not enough evidence to convict them and they claim themselves to be innocent, they're going to be found guilty. And it's going to be 6 years before they're actually put to death. August of 1927, they're going to be executed. And there were protests leading up to this because some Americans realized, like, this is wrong. Like, there's just not enough evidence. The decision in this case was not right. But ultimately, even after the requests for a pardon for these guys, they would be executed. And what the AP exam likes to do with this case is use this as an example of the Red Scare. This is a perfect example of the type of hysteria that causes people to panic and point fingers. Again, it's very similar to like the Salem witch trials. Things that we are scared of, things that we don't understand. We tend to panic, and there's fear associated with it. And oftentimes people sort of lose their heads a little bit. And these are two gentlemen that ended up being executed because of the fear and hysteria during the Red Scare. Okay, so that was yesterday's material. Hopefully that all makes sense to you guys. As you move forward, and I told you guys we were going to touch on this again because we hit the women's rights movement, right? The suffragettes, we talked about them during the progressive era, but I told you we need to spend a little bit more time on this because this is a huge turning point in American history, right? Women's rights is a major theme on the AP exam. So this is a major event in that movement because women have been pushing for more rights, right? The same types of rights that men have had in this country for many years. And this is a major step in that happening. So the first thing you have there is women's suffrage, and it's looking for the definition. Of course, it's the idea of the women's right to vote. It didn't start in the progressive era, though. You know, keep that in mind. In fact, the next category says since Seneca Falls. And remember, you guys can go even back before that, when the birth of the country happened and Abigail Adams said things like, you know, don't forget the women, you know, don't forget the ladies. When she talked to John Adams about, you know, the Constitution and rights. So this idea has been around for a long, long time. And if you guys remember at the Seneca Falls Convention, you had Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and their creation of the Declaration of Sentiments, right? Super famous document, could be on the AP exam. The idea is they took that Declaration of Independence and they added just a few words, right? All men and women are created equal. And they created this document. And those women were really pushing for the right to vote. But ultimately in the 1840s, which is when the Seneca Falls Convention happened, 1848, that would not take place, right? They would not gain the right to vote, at least on the national level. Now, I will say this, though. After the Seneca Falls Convention, certain states, not all of them, but certain states would allow women to vote in local and state elections. Sort of a nice step in the process, not exactly what they wanted, but it shows growth, right? And that was just another small step in the process. Now, World War I, though, is going to be a major, major event in regards to women's rights, because you guys know that as soldiers went off to fight in World War I, come here. You can say hi to my students. Say hi.
Hi.
Kennedy's just about to go to bed. I'll be up to tuck you in a few minutes. Okay. Yep, come here. Come on over. And this is Cameron. You can say hi too.
Hi.
Okay, I'll be up in a few minutes. Mommy will tuck you guys in. Okay. I gotta keep teaching. Go, go, go. I'll be up in a minute. Sorry, guys. So, like I was saying, World War I is a major moment for women's rights, because it offers the opportunity for women to sort of show that they deserved equal rights, and more specifically the right to vote. Because when men went off to fight in the war, you have women filling factory jobs and filling those positions and taking care of the home front. So after World War I is over with, women are really going to step on the gas and say, hey, wait a minute, like, we held this country together during those war years, 1917 and 1918, you know, when the U.S. was off at war. And this is something that women's rights groups are really going to kind of latch onto. Now, I will say this. The whole idea of the suffragettes, this started before World War I. Suffragettes were around in the early 1900s. You have a couple famous ones. Maybe you guys found them in your research. People like Alice Paul, people like Lucy Burns. These are famous suffragettes. And a lot of time the suffragettes focused on self-sacrifice to gain rights. These are women that went on hunger strikes, that were arrested multiple times, that were harassed during their protests, spit on, things thrown at them during these protests, in prison, endured some horrible, horrible treatment. They really continued to challenge the government even through all this adversity. So these are women that use some very aggressive tactics to try to gain the right to vote. And they really put pressure on President Woodrow Wilson during the war, and Congress after the war, to finally meet their demands to achieve the goal that they had been fighting for so long. And that's, of course, where we get to the 19th Amendment. Now, hey, hopefully you guys, take a look at these photographs. Take a look at these photographs too, and make sure that you guys spend a little bit of time looking at these. These are some of the women, the suffragettes protesting. These are some of the signs and the words that they used to do that. But guys, this is the moment, right? The 19th Amendment, passed in 1920, grants women the right to vote, right? Suffrage for men and women guaranteed. Struggle will continue. So I do want you guys to recognize the huge turning point, right? This is major, major. But recognize that we're going to continue to talk about certain ideas that women will continue to fight for since the 19th Amendment, since 1920. Things like equal pay, equal education and occupational opportunities. I mean, guys, you can even compare it to the present day, right? We have something called the Me Too movement, right? That's something that started just in the last year or two. Women, we know in this country, still do not receive equal pay to men who do the same job or very similar jobs. There's still a discrepancy out there as far as those opportunities go. So this is still, again, the reason it's a theme in U.S. history is because it's continuous, right? It is an issue that has endured. And women's rights is still something that we're going to continue to talk about in U.S. history, because obviously equality is not something that is really there yet. Okay, let's finish this off then, because I know this is a longer video, but it does cover 2 days worth of material. So the next page is the boom of the Roaring '20s. The boom of the Roaring '20s, we're going to start to shift into some economic ideas. Now, that's going to carry us into the next part of the note packet, but I did want to mention it here. One of the things I want you guys to recognize is that right after World War I, there's going to be an economic boom in this country, one of the most successful time periods economically that the nation has ever had. It's been said that World War I created a culture of consumerism. We became a country of buyers. After World War I, people have money. The price of goods has dropped substantially because of industrialization. America is ready to buy. Not only that, but remember that a lot of European countries were destroyed during World War I. A lot of their factories and businesses needed to be rebuilt. So, in the meantime, the United States became, in some ways, a manufacturer for not only our own people, but for the world. So in the 1920s, you have this economic boom take place, right? The culture of consumerism and all these new consumer products, toasters, refrigerators. I mean, these are things that were sort of brand new at the time period. Vacuum cleaners, right? Things that we sort of think like, well, yeah, that's normal stuff. But if you think about it, guys, those are the kinds of things that most households in the United States have. So when you think about the number of people that would want to buy those things, we're talking about almost every American in the country would want something like that. So we are going to talk more about this economic boom. But the thing that I want to jump to first, and you guys see it in your note packet, is the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. And this is where we're going to finish, okay? Now, hopefully you guys kind of have this filled in a little bit from your own research, but I'm also hoping that you guys did this reading here on the Volstead Act, provisions of the Act, and so on. And I just want to fill in these next two sections with you guys. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. You guys already know the historical circumstances for this. Alcoholism. We've talked about the temperance movement of the 1830s and 40s. We know that during the Progressive Era, there were organizations such as the Anti-Saloon League, mainly made up of middle-class women. And again, we know the problems that can happen from alcohol abuse, the health and hygiene issues, the social problems, the stress that it can put on families, right, wives, and children. But there's also this concept that it can lead to inefficiency in work, right? Again, drinking too much alcohol, being hungover. Well, you're going to go to work the next day, you're not going to be as efficient, you're going to be late to work, those types of things. There's also this thought, too, that alcoholism could lead to crime and corruption. So there are people in the United States during this time period that are going to push for the 18th Amendment to be passed. Now, one thing I do want to draw your attention to, too, this is kind of interesting. So we're actually going back, right? The 19th Amendment was in 1920. Well, this is the 18th Amendment, so it has to be before 1920, right? Just number order. But if you look down at the bottom here, right, when it talks about the 18th Amendment, it talks about the idea that it was submitted in 1917 and approved in 1919. One of the other reasons, besides all the ones we just listed about why people wanted to do away with alcohol, was during World War I, we know that rationing was something that was very much promoted to help the war effort. Well, different forms of alcohol are created by using grains, wheat and barley and oats and things like that. One of the reasons that there was even more pressure put on, because again, notice the dates, 1917 was when we got involved in World War I. Conservation of grains, rationing of grains. And they looked at this and said, well, grains are something that people need. If we're using grains to produce a recreational drink, that's a waste. So another reason that the 18th Amendment was passed was because they wanted to make sure that they were being careful with the use of grains and that they had enough grains for the American people and soldiers. So, and alcohol was not something that sort of fit into that category. Okay. So the 18th Amendment will be passed in 1919. The 18th Amendment is also sometimes referred to as the Volstead Act. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're sort of like they go hand in hand together, the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. So if you see Volstead Act on the AP exam, recognize that that is very much the 18th Amendment. After the reading here, I just want to do this top section, impacts of the, I dropped it. Impacts of the 18th Amendment right here at the top here. I think you guys probably already know this. The 18th Amendment did not go as planned. The idea was to, limit the consumption of alcohol by limiting the production, distribution, and sale of alcohol. That's what it really focused on, right? Production, distribution, and sale of alcohol. We're not going to allow those things anymore. So the idea here is that alcohol abuse would start to drop. But what ultimately ends up happening is if you are not allowing the production, distribution, and sale of alcohol, you're essentially taking away American jobs, right? At breweries and distilleries, and even, bars and pubs and those types of places. Those will ultimately shut down. Unemployment is not a good thing for our economy. So an effect of the 18th Amendment is American jobs being lost. So that's not so good, right? Another problem is that alcohol has been, and we've seen this all the way back to like the Whiskey Rebellion with George Washington, alcohol is taxable by the U.S. government. If there is no alcohol being produced, distributed, or sold, then tax dollars are being taken away from the American government. And those tax dollars obviously provide for American needs. So there's another potential problem there. We also know, though, that one of the biggest problems with the 18th Amendment is that people are going to ultimately want to find alcohol anyway. It's one thing to make a law for it, but if the American people aren't on board with that law, they're going to find sneaky ways around it. And what the 18th Amendment, one of the big effects of it, is that it ultimately leads to something called organized crime. And you guys are aware of some of these mobsters and gangsters, most famous one probably being Al Capone. But what the 18th Amendment leads to are speakeasies and bootleggers. If you guys don't know what those are, look up those definitions, right? Speakeasies and bootleggers. But it ultimately does lead to an increase in organized crime. So you have a series of problems being created because of the 18th Amendment. But this 18th Amendment will be around for a few years, not a long time, but a few years. We will talk, though, about the repeal of the 18th Amendment once we get into the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. Okay, so he'll be coming up pretty shortly here. Guys, I know that was a long video, but it did cover 2 days worth of material, and it did give you guys some valuable information about the new AP exam that you need to be ready for. Guys, take care of yourself. All right, make sure you keep working hard. I hope that you and your families are continuing to do well. And again, if you guys need anything from me, shoot me a chat through Teams or an email. Let me know how I can help you guys out. Don't forget, College Board multiple choice are already posted for you guys for the week. Your Learning Target short answer questions are going to be posted on Wednesday morning and due on Friday. And for goodness sakes, if you didn't get me your homework assignment from last week, okay, it was due on Friday. And my grades close this week, and I need to update your grades. So get that into me. All right? I will talk to you guys soon.